I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the 2 empty seats reserved for my parents. It was as if someone had carved them out of the world on purpose, leaving only the outlines where they should have been. The announcer was calling names through the speakers in Low Plaza at Columbia University. The spring air warm against my face, the cheers rolling like soft waves around me. But those 2 chairs stayed empty and cold. I remember gripping my program so tightly, the edges bent in my hand. Everyone around me had someone calling their name, waving, reaching out with pride. I was silent. And then my phone buzzed. It was from my mom. "It is just a piece of paper. Not worth flying for." I stood there with that message burning in my palm, the crowd clapping for someone nearby whose family screamed like he had just won the lottery. My mom's words sat in my chest with a weight that felt heavier than the gown I was wearing. My dad did not call at all. No text, nothing, just silence. The kind that makes your ears ring. The kind that tells you everything without saying a single thing. Grandma Ruth was the only person who came. I had arranged a cab to bring her down from Vermont because highways made her nervous, and she never trusted herself to drive long distances alone. When she stepped out of the car, she still smelled faintly of the soap she made from scratch. Her shoulders a little stooped, but her eyes bright with pride. She wrapped her arms around me, and something inside me loosened. Something I had held too tightly for too many years. She told me she would not have missed my graduation, even if she had to walk everything mile. And her voice shook the way it does when she means exactly what she says. Before I go any further, let me pause for a moment. I always wonder what people are doing when they listen to stories like this. It makes the world feel smaller and more connected. If you feel like sharing it later, tell me where you are listening from. When all of this happened, I was standing there under the sunlight in my cap and gown, feeling the air shift colder around my shoulders, even though the day was warm. Grand held my hand as we walked through the crowd together, but I could feel her slowing down step by step. She said she was fine, just tired from the long ride, but her breathing told a different story. She kept glancing at the entrance as if expecting my parents to surprise us by showing up late. But their absence thickened the air between us. I did not have the heart to tell her there was no surprise coming. They had decided long before that day that I was not worth the trip. After the ceremony, we sat on a low stone wall under a tree, where the shade fell in soft, broken patterns over the grass. Gran squeezed my hand and said she was proud in a way words could never carry. I wanted to believe her pride could be enough to fill the hollow places inside me, where my parents' love should have been. But as I watched other families gather for photos and laughter, I felt a quiet truth settle in my chest. This was not just neglect. It was not a scheduling conflict or a misunderstanding. It was a choice. They had chosen not to be here for me. Grandma tried to distract me by pointing out how beautiful the campus looked in the afternoon light, how the ivy curled around the buildings, like it was holding them close. But even she could not hide how much it hurt her to see me pretending I was fine. When she stood up, she pressed her palm to her lower back and winced. She said the bus ride had been too long and she wanted to rest before heading home. I offered to walk her to the station, but she insisted she would manage. She always tried to protect me from her pain, even on the days she could barely hide it. We hugged again before she left. She smelled like fresh earth and lavender, like safety. Her voice softened when she touched my cheek and said she wished she could stay longer. But the farm needed her. She promised she would call when she got home. As she walked away, her small frame seemed swallowed by the crowd. I stood there until I could no longer see her. The plaza emptied slowly. One by one, families walked out with arms full of flowers and balloons and framed photos. I lingered because I did not know where to go. Part of me still hoped I might hear my dad's voice behind me, calling my name the way other fathers did. But the only thing behind me was the echo of my own footsteps. And that was when it settled, fully, without drama or tears, just a cold finality in my bones. My parents did not forget to come. They decided I was not worth the trip. I walked toward the subway afterward, my gown brushing against my ankles, the program folded and refolded in my hand until the paper felt thin. I tried not to think about what it meant, about the years I had spent trying to be useful. trying to be good enough, trying to become the kind of daughter who would be easy to love. But the truth kept pressing at the edges of my mind. Nothing I did was ever going to change the way they saw me, because in their eyes, I did not exist in the way children usually exist to their parents. I was an obligation long forgotten and finally abandoned. On the train, I watched my reflection in the window sway with the motion of the car. For a moment, I did not recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked tired, but not defeated. There was a sharpness in her eyes I had not noticed before, something that had been forged quietly through years of being pushed aside. The city blurred past outside, streaks of gray and gold, and I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. It was not accepted. It was a kind of stillness that comes before a decision, a shift you can feel deep in your ribs. When I got back to my tiny apartment that night, the voicemail light on my phone blinked once. I pressed play, hoping for something from my dad, even one sentence, even the smallest acknowledgement. But it was only an automated message from the electric company reminding me of a bill due. No one else had called. The silence from my parents wrapped itself around the room, filling every corner. I sat on the edge of my bed, unpinning my cap, letting my hair fall around my shoulders. I should have cried, but the tears would not come. Instead, there was a clarity slowly unfurling in my chest. Something had ended that day, but something else had quietly begun. I was tired of chasing people who did not want to see me. I was tired of trying to earn a place in a family that had never made room for me. Gran called later that evening, her voice softer than usual. She said she had made it home, but felt more worn out than expected. She told me again how proud she was. I told her I loved her and that I would come visit soon. When we hung up, I sat alone in the quiet, listening to the refrigerator hum and the sounds of the city pushing through them. Thin walls. I kept thinking about the 2 empty chairs at my ceremony, how they seemed to glow brighter than the people who had been sitting beside them, as if their emptiness held more truth than any presence could have. I do not know how long I sat there before I finally lay back on the bed. The room felt too still. My thoughts kept circling the same question. If I disappeared from their lives entirely, would they even notice I was gone? Would anything change for them at all? And if the answer was no, then why was I still trying to make them see me? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. Something in me shifted, a quiet resolve that felt almost like a seed cracking open beneath the soil. A beginning I could not yet name. I did not know then that everything that happened at my graduation would become the first small tremor before a much larger break. I only knew that the world I had tried to build around my parents had finally collapsed, leaving empty space where something new could grow. That night, for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to imagine that maybe I was meant to step out of the shadow they kept me in. Maybe their absence was not a judgment, but an invitation to build something entirely different, something of my own. I lay there in the dark after graduation night, listening to the quiet settle against my walls, and the memory of those 2 empty chairs would not leave me. It drifted with me into sleep and followed me back into the morning, tugging open a door I had kept shut for years, a door that led straight back to the house where I first learned how easily a child could be forgotten. I was 6 years old the day I arrived at the Hale home. I still remember the smell of the social worker's coat and the way her keys jangled when she walked me up the long stone path to the front porch. The house looked like it belonged in a magazine, all clean lines and tall windows, and flowers arranged in perfect rows, but I felt small and out of place even before the door opened. My mom smiled when she saw me, a thin smile that never reached her eyes. She crouched down just far enough to pat my shoulder. She called me sweet and said she hoped I liked my new room. My dad stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, tall and quiet, and when he nodded at me, I tried to believe it meant something warm. It would take me years to understand it meant nothing at all. In the beginning, I worked so hard to be the kind of daughter they would want. I folded laundry even when no one asked me to. I cleaned up after meals, stacking plates and wiping crumbs with careful hands. I said thank you for everything. I tried not to cry at night because I thought tears might make it hard to love. I watched Bianca, who was 3 years younger than me and born into the family, and I studied the way she moved through the house without hesitation, how she asked for things without apologizing, how she never checked if she was allowed to sit on a couch or open the refrigerator. I wanted to be like that. Wanted to learn the rules of belonging. For a little while, I thought I was doing it right. My dad would pat my shoulder on his way to work. My mom would nod when I finished my chores. Bianca sometimes let me play with her toys if she was in a generous mood. There were afternoons when the light came through the windows just right, and I let myself imagine that maybe I had finally found a home. Maybe someone would come to my school recital or clap when I rode my bike without training wheels. Maybe I could stop holding my breath all the time. But the shift came slowly, the way cracks appear in a wall long before it falls. I did not notice it at first. It was in the way my mom stopped asking if I wanted to join Bianca at the playground. The way she handed me a rag and pointed to smudges on the floor that I had not made. The way Bianca rolled her eyes when I asked if she wanted to play and told me her friends did not like me because I was not really her sister. I accepted all of it quietly because quiet children were easier to love. Or so I believed. Meals were the hardest. Bianca always sat beside my mom, chattering about her day, her new shoes, her birthday party plans. I sat across from them, my legs barely reaching the edge of the chair. My mom listened to Bianca like she was sunlight, warm and bright and necessary. When I spoke, it was as if the room dimmed. My dad would glance at me sometimes, open his mouth like he might say something, then close it again and look down at his plate. I learned to stop trying. It was simpler to eat in silence. Birthdays were reminders I did not belong. Bianca's parties were loud and glittering, full of neighbors and wrapped gifts and cupcakes in neat rows. Mine were quiet affairs at the kitchen table, with a candle stuck into a single slice of store-bought cake. My mom said it was silly to make a big fuss for a child who did not like attention. I never mentioned that I did like attention. I just never received any. The comparisons were constant. Bianca was talented. Bianca was graceful. Bianca was naturally gifted. I was careful. I was quiet. I was helpful. Words that sounded gentle, but felt like walls closing in around me. And every time I tried to push through, my mom would remind me not to make things difficult. My dad would say, "Do not upset your mom," and the conversation would end there. Bianca had spilled juice on the living room rug while we were playing. When my mom walked in, Bianca pointed at me before I could speak. She said I had knocked the cup over. I tried to explain, but my voice trembled and my mom cut me off. She told me to clean it up and not argue. I got down on my knees and scrubbed while Bianca sat on the couch and watched. My dad walked in later, saw me kneeling there, and asked what happened. Bianca answered before I could. My dad nodded slowly, patted Bianca's head, then left the room. I kept scrubbing until my fingers hurt, even though the stain had already lifted. I scrubbed because I did not know what else to do with the shame burning under my skin. The years between 9 and 12 blurred into a quiet ache. I learned to move softly, to anticipate what my mom wanted before she said it, to stay out of Bianca's way whenever possible. I washed dishes before school. I folded the laundry after. I vacuumed the hallways. My mom used to say the house ran smoother when I was obedient. I believed her. At that age, you believe anything from the people you want to love you, but everything broke when I turned 12. My mom had spent the day snapping at me for reasons I still cannot piece together. I forgot to take the trash out. I folded Bianca's sweaters the wrong way. I hummed while doing my homework, and it annoyed her. The house felt charged, restless. I kept trying to make myself smaller. That evening, during dinner, Bianca complained that her favorite shirt had shrunk in the wash. She said I must have ruined it on purpose. I shook my head and said I had not touched it, but my mom slammed her fork down and told me she had had enough. Her voice rose, sharp and steady, louder than anything I had ever heard from her. She said I did not fit this family. She said I brought tension into the house, that I was not like them, that she had tried to make it work, but some things just did not take. I stared at her, the words settling into me like stones dropping into a deep pool. My dad sat there with his hands wrapped around his glass, shoulders drawn in. He did not speak until the silence became too thick to breathe in. When he finally looked at me, he looked tired, older than I had ever seen him. He said it might be better if I stayed with Grandma for a while, just until things calmed down. I asked how long that meant. He did not answer the question. He stood up and said it would be good for me. He said Grandma loved me. He said it would help. That night, I packed my things. It did not take long. Everything I owned fit into a small suitcase, the kind with wheels that stuck on carpet. I kept waiting for someone to stop me, waiting for my mom to soften, or for Bianca to say she did not really mean her accusations, waiting for my dad to tell me this was temporary and that he wanted me to stay. No one did. My dad drove me to Vermont early the next morning. I sat in the back seat because Bianca had claimed the front, even though she was still half asleep. My dad kept his eyes on the road. I watched the trees grow denser as we left Connecticut, watched the sky turn paler as the hours stretched on. When we finally reached Grandma's driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires felt too loud, like an ending echoing across the yard. Gran stepped outside with her flannel shirt and her boots still dusty from the fields. She hugged me tightly and asked if everything was all right. My dad said it was only temporary. He said once things settled at home, we would talk again. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and told me if I became useful, we would find our way back to each other. Useful, as if love had to be earned like a wage. He left quickly after that. Bianca waved without getting out of the car. My mom did not come. The sound of the engine pulling away lingered longer than his goodbye. I stood there in the quiet Vermont air with my suitcase beside me and realized I had not been sent away for a visit. I had been removed like an object that did not fit the room. Grand helped me carry my things inside, looking gently about fixing up the spare room and making pancakes in the morning. Her kindness made the truth sharper. I was no longer part of the Hale home. Maybe I never really had been. As I lay in the small room Grandma prepared for me, listening to the wind press against the windows, I understood something without needing anyone to explain it. The moment I stepped out of that house, I stopped being their child. I had lost my place in their lives with one packed suitcase and a car ride north. And though I did not know it then, that loss would shape everything that came after. Life in Vermont settled into a rhythm quickly. Grandma woke before sunrise every day, her footsteps soft but purposeful as she moved through the farmhouse. She let me sleep a little longer at first, but soon I found myself waking early too, drawn into the quiet discipline of her mornings. The air was cold, even in late spring, and when I stepped outside to help with the chores, I could see my breath floating in front of me. My hands grew calloused from carrying buckets and pulling weeds, and the muscles in my back ached in a way I was not used to. But there was a steadiness to it, a kind of work that expected nothing more than effort and honesty. That made it easier than anything I had ever done in the Hale house. After chores, I would sit at the small kitchen table with my homework spread out before me. Gran would pour me a cup of hot cocoa, sometimes adding a little cinnamon, and she would sit across from me with the newspaper folded in her hands. She never hovered. She never corrected me unless I asked. She simply existed beside me in a way that made me feel less alone. I caught her watching me sometimes, her eyes soft with something like worry, but she never pushed me to talk about what happened. She let silence do its own work. School was the hardest part, not because of the classes, but because of the questions. Kids could sense when someone did not belong. They asked why I lived with my grandma. They asked where my parents were. They said it like it was a joke, like the punchline was that I had been unwanted. I learned to shrug and say my parents traveled a lot. Sometimes they believed me. Sometimes they did not. One girl named Lila looked me up and down on my first day and said she could tell I was not from around here because my clothes looked too neat and my shoes were too clean. I wanted to tell her those clothes had once belonged to Bianca, passed down without a word of kindness. But I kept my mouth shut. I knew better than to offer explanations to people who asked questions just to hurt you. There was one teacher who made those early years even harder. His name was Mr. Porter, and he taught math in a way that made everything feel like a test of who deserved to be in the room. One day, he asked each of us to share what our parents did for work as part of a lesson on income brackets. When it was my turn, I said my grandma ran a small farm. He raised his eyebrows and said that was not quite the same as having a proper career. A few kids laughed. My cheeks burned hot and I wished I could disappear. After class, he kept me behind and asked if I had trouble understanding certain material. I told him I was doing fine. He smiled like he did not believe me and said some students simply came from homes where academics were not a priority. I walked out of that classroom determined to prove him wrong, not for pride, but because I needed something to anchor myself to, something that belonged to me. School became a place where I worked quietly and tirelessly. I stayed up late to use the library computers. I took extra worksheets home even when Grandma told me not to overwork myself. She would say learning was not a race. I would nod, but inside, I felt a clock ticking. I did not know exactly what I was running toward, but I knew what I was running from. I never wanted to be sent away again. By the time I reached high school, I had grown used to balancing farm chores, schoolwork, and the loneliness that clung to me like a second skin. The loneliness became familiar, almost comforting. It kept me focused. I volunteered for anything that looked like responsibility. I tutored younger students. I helped reorganize the library. I joined the debate, even though my voice shook when I stood in front of people. I figured if I could make myself useful enough, maybe it would matter to someone someday. One afternoon in my junior year, we had a career exploration event where different professionals came to talk about their fields. I wandered past tables of firefighters, nurses, mechanics, and teachers until I reached a booth run by a woman in a sharp blazer, holding a stack of brochures. She worked in financial risk analytics. I had never heard of the field, but she explained it in a way that made my heart tighten. She said the job was about identifying danger before it swallowed people whole. It was about understanding patterns, reading between the lines, predicting what others missed. It was not glamorous, it was not loud, it was the kind of work that mattered quietly. Something about it felt familiar, like the way I had learned to watch every shift in my mom's tone or every change in my dad's expression. I had spent my life predicting storm fronts in people. Maybe I could learn to do it with numbers, too. I took a brochure home and read it until the corners curled. Gran nodded when I told her I wanted to pursue it. She said it sounded practical. That word struck me more deeply than I expected. Practical. Useful. The two things I had been taught to value above everything else. I wanted to believe that being useful would be enough to keep me from ever being pushed out again. College applications were a blur of essays written in the glow of Grandma's old lamp and recommendation letters from teachers who had finally stopped underestimating me. When I got accepted into a small university in Massachusetts, Grandma cried quietly into her apron. She said she was proud, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She hated the thought of me leaving. Even if only a few hours away, I hugged her tightly and promised to come home often, though I knew life had a way of pulling people apart, no matter what promises they made. College was another world. It smelled like possibility and exhaustion. I worked part-time at the campus bookstore and picked up shifts at a local diner one weekends. I learned to run on little sleep and strong coffee. I spent hours in the library, diving into statistics and modeling patterns until numbers felt like a language I could speak without thinking. I did not try to make many friends. I had grown too used to the quiet. But I found comfort in the structure of learning. It gave me the shape of my days. Money was always tight. I applied for scholarships, grants, and anything else that could lighten the load. Gran sent what she could, which was never much, but always wrapped in love. And I made up the rest through work. I never asked my parents for help. I doubted they would give it even if I tried. I had not spoken to them in years. Every birthday passed without a call. Every holiday came and went without a message. I watched other students pack for Thanksgiving or winter break, while I stayed behind to work extra shifts. Sometimes the loneliness hit hard enough to make my hands shake. But I did what I had always done. I kept going. When I finished my undergraduate degree, I remember walking across the stage with a calmness I did not expect. It was not joy or pride. It was something steadier, a quiet acknowledgement that I had kept a promise to myself. Gran drove down in her old truck, the one that rattled on hills, and she sat in the front row with a bouquet of grocery store flowers that smelled faintly of lemons. She hugged me afterward and said I had built a life from nothing but grit. I told her I could not have done it without her. She touched my cheek the way she did when I was little and said love was easier to give than people thought. I went straight into a graduate program after that. Another set of long nights heavy textbooks, and modeling software that made my eyes blur. I took on more work at a local bank doing basic clerical tasks, and eventually moved into data organization. I tried not to think about the Hale family during those years. Whenever their name crossed my mind, I felt an ache somewhere deep in my ribs, a reminder that even success could not rewrite a childhood. I pushed it down and focused on building something stable, something that belonged only to me. It took time, but I slowly realized that no matter how much I learned or how hard I worked, that useful word had become a cage I had stepped into willingly. I thought if I was useful enough, someone would choose me. Someone would stay. Someone would say I mattered. But usefulness was not love. It never had been. It took me nearly 2 decades to understand that. On the morning of my graduate school commencement, as I buttoned the gown and looked at myself in the mirror of my small apartment, I felt that truth settle into place. I was the girl who had been sent away with one suitcase because she did not fit a family. I had spent years trying to fix myself when the brokenness had never belonged to me in the first place. I did not know that the morning after my graduation would bring the kind of phone call that makes your stomach drop before you even understand why. I had barely slept, still replaying the ceremony in my mind, still seeing those empty chairs like ghosts in the crowd. When the phone rang, I thought it might be Grandma calling to say she reached home safely. Instead, it was her neighbor, a nervous tremor in her voice as she told me Grandma had slipped on the back steps and fallen hard. The paramedics had taken her to the hospital in Burlington. She said I should come as soon as I could. I do not remember the drive, except for the blur of highway trees and the pounding in my chest. It felt like the world was tilting, like something inside me that had held on for too long was finally cracking. By the time I reached the hospital, the late afternoon sun was turning the windows gold. The automatic doors opened to the smell of disinfectant and a quiet hum of machines. I walked down the hallway with my throat tightening, afraid of what I might find behind her curtain. Gran lay in the hospital bed with her gray hair fanned across the pillow like a soft halo. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. There was a bruise blossoming across her cheek, and her wrist was wrapped in a thick bandage. When she saw me, her smile flickered to life, weak, but warm enough to steady my shaking breath. She reached for my hand, and her fingers felt cold. I asked her what happened, and she tried to wave it off. She said she had been hurrying to bring in a basket of laundry when her foot slipped. She tried to laugh about it, but the sound collapsed into a wince. The nurse told me it had been a bad fall, a fractured wrist, bruised ribs, dehydration. She would need rest. Lots of it. I sat beside Grandma in the hospital room long after the nurses finished checking her vitals. The evening light coming through the blinds felt softer than usual, washed in a kind of gray calm that made everything inside the room look still, almost paused. The fall had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She tried to smile whenever I met her eyes, but her breath came short, and her hands trembled each time she reached for her water. She told me she had slipped while trying to reach the top shelf in the pantry. I knew that was not the whole story. She had been moving slower these past months, leaning on the counter when she thought no one was looking. The truth was, she had been running on borrowed strength for too long. I pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, and she gave me that familiar look that meant she was about to say something she had been holding back. She had worn that same look years ago when I first arrived at her farm, a scared 12-year-old with a single suitcase and the heaviness of being unwanted, sitting right at the center of my chest. She asked me to sit closer. I did, taking her hand gently. Her skin felt thin, fragile in a way that made something tighten inside my throat. She said there was something she had meant to tell me for a long time but could not find the right moment. She said she had hoped she would have more years, more time, and that she could let the truth settle into the right shape before handing it to me. But the fall had made her realize that time was running out faster than she wished. I asked her what she meant. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a slow breath, as if gathering a strength that had been slipping away from her little by little. She said that the story I had been told about my adoption was not the entire truth. Her voice was soft, quiet, but firm enough that every word felt like it pressed into the air between us. She said she did not know everything, but she knew enough to understand that something had been kept from me, something important, something I deserved to know. The room felt smaller as she spoke. The steady beep of the heart monitor seemed suddenly louder. I waited, holding my breath without meaning to. Grandma opened her eyes again. There was a sadness there I had never seen before. A sadness shaped like regret. She reached slowly toward the bedside table and pulled out an old envelope from the drawer. It was yellowed at the edges, the flap worn soft from being handled many times. She placed it in my hands and closed her fingers around mine, guiding them gently. She told me she had found it years ago among the papers that had been given to her when she took me in. She had kept it safe, but had hesitated to show it to me. She said she had wanted to wait until I was strong enough to face questions without losing myself in them. She said she had watched me grow into someone who carried pain quietly, someone who pushed forward even when the road was steep. She believed I was ready now. I asked her what was inside, though part of me already sensed the answer. She looked at me with a tenderness that made my chest ache. She said it contained the first piece of the truth about where I truly came from. Not the polished version my parents had repeated, not the simplified one I had used to survive. Something deeper, something that had been hidden. She did not explain more. She only told me that she could not take this knowledge to the grave, that I deserved to know who had wanted me, who had let me go, and who had stepped into the spaces between those decisions. Her voice trembled at the end, and she reached up to touch my cheek. She said I had always been worth the truth, even if others had been afraid to speak it. I felt the envelope in my hands, light in weight but heavy with implication. My mind spun with questions I was not sure I wanted answers to. I had grown used to the story I had been told, even if it had never fit quite right. I had lived inside the outline of an explanation that left too many blank spaces. Now those spaces seemed to hum with meaning. I asked Grandma if my parents knew about this. She hesitated. She said she believed my mom knew more than she ever admitted. She said she was not sure what my dad had been told at the time, only that the tension around my adoption had never fully settled in that house. She said some people build their lives on the version of truth that feels safest to them, and they hold on even when it starts to crack. The room was quiet for a long moment. I stared at the envelope as if it might shift in my hands. Outside the window, the sky was turning darker, the first stars faint against the deepening blue. I felt the weight of my childhood in that silence. Every unanswered question, every cold moment at the dinner table, every time I had been treated like a guest in my own home. Gran squeezed my hand gently. She told me I did not need to open the envelope yet. She said the truth would wait for me. She said she wanted to see the look in my eyes when I finally knew everything. But even if she did not, she hoped the truth would free me rather than break me. I leaned forward and rested my forehead against her hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt the warmth of her fingers and the fragility of her pulse beneath them. I realized how much she had carried alone. Later that night, after she drifted into sleep, I sat in the chair by her bed and stared at the machines keeping rhythm with her, breathing. Nurses passed quietly in the hallway. The hospital lights hummed softly, a kind of steady white noise. I held the envelope against my chest and tried to imagine what waited inside. A name, a date, a signature. Maybe all three. Or maybe something that would shift every part of the story I had built around me, life. When Grandma woke again, it was early morning. Her voice was weaker, but her eyes were clearer. She asked me to promise something. She said that no matter what I found inside that envelope, I needed to remember that my worth was never tied to the story other people told about me. She said I had made a life she was proud of, not because of where I came from, but because of who I had chosen to become. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat and promised her I would not let the truth swallow me. She smiled, a small, tired smile, and said that was all she needed to hear. The doctor came in shortly after to check on her. He said she was stable, but would need time to regain her strength. He suggested I go home and rest. I did not want to leave, but Grandma insisted. She said she would be fine for a few hours and that I looked like I had not slept in days. Before I left, I kissed her forehead and told her I would return in the evening. She nodded and closed her eyes again, her breathing slow and steady. I walked out of the hospital with the envelope tucked safely inside my coat. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of distant rain. I stood at the edge of the parking lot for a long moment, watching the clouds gather. Something was shifting. I could feel it in the coolness of the breeze, in the heaviness of the envelope, in the tremor of curiosity inside my chest. I did not open it. Not yet. Instead, I drove home in silence, letting the hum of the road steady my thoughts. There would be a time for answers. But first, I needed to understand the questions. The truth was no longer something I feared. It was something I was finally ready to face. I drove home from the hospital without turning on the radio. The envelope sat in the passenger seat like a living thing, quiet but pulsing with meaning. I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to move, half afraid that opening it would change something I could never put back the way it was. When I finally stepped inside my apartment, I placed it gently in the top drawer of my dresser and closed it. I needed a night, just one night to let the truth settle in the room with me before I invited it any closer. I took a shower, made tea I barely touched, and sat on the edge of my bed until exhaustion pulled me under. But sleep did not come cleanly. I drifted in and out, feeling as if the envelope were whispering from across the room, telling me that the truth was already in motion, whether I was ready or not. Sometime close to dawn, my phone rang. The noise cracked through the quiet so sharply that my heart jumped. I reached for it, still tangled in sleep, and saw a number I knew too well. Connecticut area code. My mom. For a moment, I stared at it, torn between letting it ring and answering out of instinct. I had not heard her voice in years. She had not even texted me the day of my graduation. Whatever this was, it was not about me. It was about something she wanted, I answered. Her voice came through fast and sharp, the way it always had when she felt cornered. She said she needed to speak with me immediately. No greeting, no breath, just urgency sliced thin and cold. I asked her slowly what was wrong. Her response came in fragments. There was a situation, a serious one. Bianca was involved, business trouble, legal trouble. She kept tripping over her own sentences, as if speaking them out loud made the situation more real. I asked again what happened, and this time she lowered her voice, as if someone in the house might overhear. She said Bianca had fallen behind on payments for her company. She said a creditor had taken control of the debt. She said they were threatening action that could ruin everything. She said they needed advice. They needed someone who understood the system. They needed me. Not congratulations on my degree. Not concerned about grandma. Not a single word that sounded like family. They needed my skills, nothing else. I told her I had just gotten home from the hospital and had barely slept. She dismissed it immediately. She said this matter could not wait. She said people were watching them. She said the name Hale carried weight, and that weight was at risk of collapsing. For a moment, I let silence hang between us. Silence had been my only power in that house when I was a child. She never knew what to do with it. Even now, her breath quickened in the pause. She pressed again, asking if I had contacts, if I could help navigate the situation, if I could find out who the creditor was. There was no apology in her voice. No softness. Just the expectation that I would show up now that the golden daughter had stumbled. I told her I would look into it. The line went quiet for a second, and for the first time in years, I heard something tremble in her voice. She thanked me. Or she came as close to thanking me as she could. Then she hung up. I sat there in bed holding the phone, feeling the strangeness of the moment settle over me. I had not even opened the envelope from Grandma, and already the past was reaching for me from another angle. My family had ignored me for over a decade. Until now. Until they needed something. The sun had begun to rise, casting a pale glow across my room. I got up slowly, dressed, and made myself drink half a cup of coffee before driving to the office. The world felt muffled around me, as if I were watching it all from behind glass. When I arrived, the team was already gathering files for a new portfolio review. I set my things down and forced my mind into the structured calm that work required. Numbers never lied. They did not hide their intentions or twist themselves into prettier shapes. They simply told the truth, whether people wanted to hear it or not. I took the stack of files assigned to me and carried them to my desk. The first few were small business accounts, manageable and straightforward. Then I reached the middle of the stack and froze. The top folder was labeled with an account number I recognized from my mom's, Panicked Rambling. Underneath the code were the words Hale Living and Design. My stomach tightened. I opened the folder and there it was. Bianca Hale. The name looked almost harmless, typed neatly on the page, but the numbers beneath it told another story. Past due balances stretching across months, vendor complaints, lawsuits preparing to file, a total debt of $4.8 million, payments missed repeatedly, no reasonable plan for recovery, a complete financial collapse, wrapped in glossy branding and curated perfection. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the page. The contrast between the girl who once tossed her hair and laughed about how easy life was and the woman represented in the report was jarring. Failure was foreign to her world. Consequences, even more so. I read through the documents again, slower this time. Each line painted a picture of someone who had never learned how to stand on her own feet. Someone who had always been caught before she could fall. Someone who had never been told no. And now she had fallen so far she could not climb back up without help. I let out a long breath and closed the folder. The memory of my mom's voice scraped through my mind. The urgency, the entitlement, the fear. They needed me because they had no one else left to call. Not truly. The truth inside Grandma's envelope might have been the first crack in the wall, but this was the moment the whole thing began to crumble. My supervisor called my name from across the office, asking if I could join him in the conference room. I brought the file with me. He explained that the firm was considering acquiring several high-risk accounts from a distressed business lender, and Bianca's debt was one of the largest. He asked if I could do a deeper analysis, given my background. I kept my face neutral and said yes. My personal connection was invisible to him. My training had taught me how to keep it that way. When the meeting ended, I returned to my desk and stared at Bianca's file for a long time. The numbers were not simply numbers anymore. They were choices, doors, consequences, power. I thought about calling my mom back and asking why she had not once picked up the phone for me before this moment. I thought about asking my dad why he could sleep at night, pretending I did not exist, while pouring money into a daughter who did nothing but spend. I thought about all the birthdays they had skipped, the holidays they had forgotten, the graduation seats they had left empty. All of it wrapped itself around me in a quiet ache. Then I thought about Grandma, her voice trembling as she handed me the envelope, about the truth waiting for me at home. And I realized I was standing at the intersection of two stories, the one they had written for me, and the one I was finally ready to write for myself. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the portfolio, making notes, and running projections. When lunchtime came, I walked outside and let the cold Vermont air clear my thoughts. Then I made a decision, a quiet one. A steady one, a decision that belonged entirely to me. I drove to the courthouse and filed paperwork to expand my LLC, something I had been meaning to do for months. Then I made the calls required to purchase the debt privately through my own company. It was legal, clean, quiet, and entirely within my rights. When the final confirmation came through, I felt a strange stillness settle over me. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt something much quieter, something like the ground shifting beneath my feet. I now held the power to decide what happened next, not out of revenge, not out of spite, but because fate had placed their downfall in my hands, and I intended to handle it with clarity they had never shown me. I returned home that evening and opened the dresser drawer. The envelope from Grandma still sat there, waiting patiently. I placed Bianca's debt file beside it. Two truths. One about where I came from, one about where I was going. I touched the envelope gently, then the file, and realized they were connected in ways none of us could yet see. And for the first time in my life, I felt no fear at all. I woke the next morning with the kind of heaviness that makes it difficult to tell whether you actually slept or simply drifted through the night in pieces. The envelope from Grandma was still in the top drawer of my dresser, untouched. I had opened the drawer once during the night, stood there staring at the flap for a long moment, and then closed it again. I was not ready. Not after the call from my mom. Not after learning that Bianca's world was balanced on a cliff I now controlled. My mind was too full. the air around me too tight to let any more truth in just yet. I made coffee out of habit, though I barely tasted it. The morning light came through the window pale and colorless, the kind of light that makes everything look softer, but no less sharp. I checked my phone, not sure what I expected. My mom had not texted again. The last message from her still glowed on my screen from the night before. The urgency, the panic, the entitlement wrapped in fear. I read it once more, then set the phone face down on the counter. Part of me thought my dad would call next. That had always been the pattern. My mom would push first, loud and emotional. And when that did not work, my dad would follow with calm authority to smooth things over. It was a dance I had learned well as a child. She erupted, and he translated. She demanded, and he quieted. Together, they created a world in which Bianca shined and I dimmed. It was not a world that belonged to me, but I had lived in its shadows long enough to recognize its choreography. This time, there was no dance. There was no follow-up call. The silence from my dad felt heavier than any words he could have said. It told me everything I needed to know. He did not feel the need to reach out with explanations or apologies or requests. He assumed I would come. He assumed I would help. He assumed I still lived under the rules of their house, even after all these years. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a message. Not a call, a text. My dad had written only 4 words. We need to meet. Tomorrow. No greeting, no context, no signature. No mention of my graduation or grandma or anything remotely human. The message read like a business instruction, a directive rather than a request. It carried the same cold expectation that had been present in every decision about my life when I was a child. You will do this. You will understand this. You will show up when called. I stared at those words for a long time. They felt familiar in the worst way. The old version of me might have responded immediately, might have rearranged everything in my life to accommodate their needs. But I was not that girl anymore. I deleted the notification and let the silence settle. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling beside me, and for the first time since my mom's call, I felt something shift. Not anger, not fear, something calmer. A line being drawn within me, steady and quiet. I realized I needed to go to that meeting. But not for them. Not because they expected it. I needed to go, because the place I had been pushed out of all those years ago, longer held the same power over me. I could walk into that house now without letting it define me. Still, I was not foolish. I had leverage now, and I needed protection to use it wisely. So I called Naomi Pierce. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk in the way of someone already halfway through her day. I explained that I needed her counsel for a family-related matter connected to a debt file and a potential dispute. I did not give her every detail. Not yet. But I said enough for her to understand that emotions and legal consequences were entwined. She asked if I could come by her office within the hour. I told her I could. I gathered the folders I had assembled the night before, Bianca's debt acquisition documents, my own notes, the envelope Grandma had given me. I placed it carefully in a separate folder, not because I planned to reveal it, but because instinct told me it belonged with the rest of the truth I was preparing to face. The drive to Naomi's office took less than 15 minutes. The sky had brightened, though it still felt subdued, as if the day was holding its breath. Naomi greeted me with her usual calm efficiency and led me into her office. She did not waste time. She asked what I needed, and I laid out the broad strokes. I told her the portfolio had come across my desk and that it included the debt belonging to someone connected to my past. I told her I had purchased the debt privately through my LLC. I told her the family had contacted me in a state of panic. Naomi listened without interrupting, her gaze steady and direct. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said the simplest, most grounding thing she could have said. She told me that I had done nothing wrong, that I was within my rights to acquire the debt, that I had no legal obligation to provide relief unless I chose to. Her tone was steady and professional, but there was an undercurrent of concern when she asked about my emotional safety in re-entering a household that had caused so much harm. I told her I was prepared this time. She nodded and began reviewing the documents. She highlighted sections she thought might become relevant and flagged pages that should be in my possession during the meeting. She helped me organize everything into a binder with labeled dividers. Her presence made everything feel clearer, more manageable. Facts had a structure. The past did not. Before I left, she looked at the extra folder I had brought, the one containing the envelope from Grandma. She asked if it was connected. I hesitated and told her I was not sure yet. She advised me to bring it, but to keep it closed until I felt ready. She reminded me that the truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. Her words echoed Grandma's, though spoken with a different kind of wisdom. When I stepped out of her office, the sun had finally broken through the clouds. It cast a warm light across the parking lot, a light that felt almost out of place with everything stirring inside me. I placed the binder in the passenger seat and rested my hands on the wheel for a moment. I thought back to the last time I had driven this route toward Connecticut. I had been 12 years old, sitting and convinced that if I could be good enough, useful enough, perfect enough, they would let me come home again. Now I was returning as an entirely different person. I went home and packed a small bag. Clothes that were simple, clean, professional. I had no desire to impress anyone. I only wanted to walk into that house with the same steadiness I felt building inside me. I left the envelope in the binder. There was a chance I would need it tomorrow. There was also a chance I might not. Either way, it traveled with me. The drive to Connecticut took several hours. The landscape changed slowly, from rolling hills to the busier lines of suburban streets. As I got closer, my chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. Memory lived in these roads, women into the places where I had once sat in the back seat watching the world blur past, hoping to be seen by people who never truly looked at me. When I turned into the familiar neighborhood, my hands tightened on the wheel. The Hale house looked the same from a distance, tall and polished, a place that had once seemed too large for me to fill. The driveway was empty except for my dad's car. The windows glowed with the warm light of late afternoon. It all looked deceptively peaceful, but I knew better. I parked near the end of the driveway and sat still for a moment, letting the quiet settle in my lungs. Then I reached for the binder on the seat beside me. I held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything inside. Debt documents, legal preparation, a sealed envelope containing the beginning of a truth that had waited too long. I stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, just as it had the day my dad drove me away from this house years ago. But this time, my steps were steady. This time, I was not walking out. I was walking in. I lifted my hand and knocked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps on the hardwood floor and the familiar click of the deadbolt turning. My dad opened the door. He looked older than I remembered, more worn around the eyes, but the guarded expression was the same. He stepped aside without a word to let me in. The hallway smelled exactly as it used to, a mix of lemon cleaner and something floral my mom liked to spray in the air. It felt as if time had folded in on itself and brought me back to a place I had once been told was home. I followed him into the living room. The lights were bright and almost harsh. My mom stood near the fireplace, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. Bianca sat on the edge of the couch, her hands twisting together. When she saw me, her face flushed, not with anger this time, but with something close to panic. My mom did not greet me. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a delivery, not a daughter. My dad cleared his throat and said we should sit. He motioned to one of the chairs, but I remained standing. Something about sitting felt too much like surrender. The room fell quiet, except for the faint hum of the air vent above us. My mom spoke first. She said there had been some developments that required immediate resolution. She said Bianca was in trouble and that the family needed to handle it quickly before things became public. Bianca looked down at her lap as tears gathered in her eyes. She said her company had run into problems. Vendors had filed complaints. Some legal actions were pending. She said it all in a rush, her voice shaking at the edges. My dad stepped in then. He said the situation was more serious than Bianca wanted to admit. He said a creditor had recently gained control of the debt that could force her into personal bankruptcy. He said this creditor had refused to negotiate, refused to offer extensions or restructuring. He said they needed to find out who it was and convince them to be reasonable. I listened to all of this calmly. It was strange. Watching them scramble for information I already knew. My mom looked at my dad with impatience. then back at me as if expecting me to have a solution. She asked if I had any contacts who could help. Her voice carried the same tone she used when she asked me to clean spills I had not made. The tone that assumed I existed only to be useful. I let a moment pass before I answered. Then I told them the truth. I said I knew who controlled the debt. Every pair of eyes in the room fixed on me. My mom straightened. My dad frowned. Bianca's lips parted in a soundless whisper. I said the creditor was me. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence in the room was sharp enough to cut. My dad blinked once, his expression tightening. My mom took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. Bianca stared at me with a confusion that shifted quickly into disbelief. My mom spoke first. She asked how I could possibly be involved. Her voice was clipped, already sliding toward accusation. I told her I worked in distressed debt acquisition and that the portfolio containing Bianca's account had come across my desk. I told them I legally purchased the debt through my own company. My mom's shock turned instantly to anger. She said I had no right to interfere in their affairs. She said I was trying to embarrass them, trying to ruin the family name. I felt something inside me settle as she spoke. She was predictable in her fury, as sharp and cold as I remember. My dad tried to calm her, but his voice faltered. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something else I could not name. Bianca stood slowly, her hands shaking. She asked why I had done it. Her voice cracked on the question. It carried none of the superiority she once wore like perfume. She looked younger than her years, frightened in a way that made her seem fragile. I told them the truth, again, that it had come across my desk by chance, that the decision to buy it had been mine, that I had not planned any of it. My voice did not rise. I did not defend myself. I simply laid the facts in front of them. Like cards in a quiet game, they did not yet understand. My mom interrupted, saying none of this mattered. She said what mattered was undoing the damage. She demanded that I release the debt back to them, or at least agree to forgive most of it. She spoke as if my involvement was a personal insult, as if I had stepped out of line. Her tone made it clear she still expected me to be the obedient child who did chores without complaint. I looked at her for a long moment before I replied. I told her I was willing to consider any arrangement, but there would be conditions. My mom's mouth fell slightly open. My dad shifted in his chair. Bianca's breathing quickened. I said that before anything else happened, before any negotiation or discussion about debt or legal consequences, I wanted the truth, not the version they had always handed me, not the quiet lies wrapped in polite sentences. I wanted the truth about why I had been sent away, about what had happened in this house, about the things Grandma's envelope hinted at. I said nothing would move forward until the truth came out. My mom took a step toward me, her face flushed. She said I was being dramatic. She said the past was the past. She said dragging old things into the present would help no one. I held her gaze and said I disagreed. I said the past was exactly what brought us to this room. My dad stood then, the movement abrupt. He looked between the two of us, torn in that familiar way. He asked me what truth I was talking about. His voice was softer than the rest of him, a tremble beneath the steady tone. I could tell he was frightened of the answer. I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. My mom's eyes followed the motion like a hawk tracking prey. My dad stared at it as if it might burn him. I did not open it. I simply rested my hand on it. I told them Grandma had given me something before her fall, something that suggested I was not who they had claimed I was, something that made it clear there were pieces of my life they had never intended me to discover. My mom's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She said Grandma always liked to stir things. She said I should not put weight on the ramblings of an old woman, but her voice was not steady. It cracked in places she tried to hide. My dad looked at her strangely, something uncertain in his eyes. Doubt, maybe. Or recognition. A seed of both. I said again that nothing would move forward with Bianca's debt until the truth was spoken aloud. I said I was done living in shadows cast by their decisions. The room felt tight with tension. My mom's fury simmered. My dad's confusion deepened. Bianca looked between us as if she were watching a storm gather and had no idea where to run. My mom stepped closer still, and told me I had no right to demand anything. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. She said she had taken me in when no one else wanted me. She said I had repaid her kindness with betrayal. The familiar sting of those words hit me. But beneath that sting was something new, something steadier. I no longer felt small beneath her anger. I told her quietly that taking someone in is not the same as loving them, and that sending a child away is not kindness in any world I know. My dad flinched at that, his hands clenched at his sides. I could see something breaking open inside him, a crack running through the middle of his certainty. Bianca sank back onto the couch, tears slipping down her cheeks. She whispered my name, her voice barely audible. It was the first time she had spoken it with something like remorse. I stood still, calm in a way that surprised even me. The balance in the room had shifted. For the first time in my life, I was not the powerless one in this house. I was not the child waiting to be told what I was worth. I was the one setting the terms, the one with the truth on my side, the one they needed. My dad sank into his chair as if the weight of years had finally settled on his shoulders. He looked at me, then at the folder on the table, then at my mom. His voice was quiet when he spoke. He said we would talk, and he said it not as a demand, but as a recognition, a crack in the old order. I nodded once. The room felt still, suspended. A shift had begun. A shift that none of us could undo. And I knew then that whatever came next would change everything. My dad looked from me to the folder on the table, then back again, as if the truth were something he could delay simply by refusing to meet its eyes. The room felt so still I could hear the faint ticking of the thermostat on the wall. My mom stood rigid beside the fireplace. Bianca crumpled on the couch like a child bracing for a punishment she already knew was coming. I kept my hand on the folder, steady and patient. I had spent a lifetime waiting for honesty in this house. I could wait a few moments longer. My dad finally exhaled, a slow and trembling sound, and sank deeper into his chair. He asked me to open the folder. The request came out strained, almost hoarse. His voice was not the same one that had summoned me here with cold authority. It was thinner now, unsure, weighted with something he did not yet understand. I opened the folder and placed 2 documents on the table. The first was the initial DNA panel that Grandma had kept hidden for years. The second was the more recent test I'd taken quietly to confirm what she feared. Both papers lay between us like silent witnesses. I did not push them toward him. I let him choose to reach for them. He hesitated. His hand trembled once, then steadied. Slowly, he picked up the first page. His eyes scanned the top line once, then again, and I watched confusion slip into disbelief. He followed the markers down the page, his brow tightening as each section contradicted the life he had believed in for more than 30 years. Then his eyes stopped on the line that determined paternal probability. His lips parted. He whispered the result under his breath, as if saying it softly might soften the blow. Bianca was not his biological daughter. The truth flashed through the room like lightning. No one said anything, but the silence cracked open in every direction. My mom froze mid-breath. Bianca let out a gasp and covered her mouth with both hands as tears spilled down her cheeks. My dad stared at the paper, eyes wide with horror, as if the letters themselves were burning into him. But he had not yet reached the worst part. His fingers, shaking now, lifted the second document. He read the first line, then the second. His eyes narrowed when he reached the markers for the second test. He followed each result carefully and stopped again at the section identifying biological relationships. His breath caught, then stopped altogether for a moment. He looked up at me, eyes glassy, stunned, disbelieving. I was his daughter by blood, not adopted, not taken in out of obligation. Not a child placed with him out of convenience. His daughter. The air seemed to thicken around us, heavy with a truth too large to fit inside the room. My dad pressed his free hand against his chest, his face draining of color. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the arm of the chair. His breathing turned uneven, as if the ground had shifted beneath him, and he had no footing left. For a moment, I thought he would fall. My instinct was to move toward him, but I stayed still. He needed to feel this without being rescued. My mom reacted first. She lunged toward the table, reaching for the papers in a frantic motion. I pulled them back before she could grab them. Her voice rose, sharp and furious, accusing me of forging documents and manipulating the situation. She claimed I had twisted Grandma's intentions, that I had planned this, that I wanted revenge. Her words tumbled out faster and louder, as if the sheer force of her voice might drown the truth. My dad raised a hand and told her to stop. He did not raise his voice. He did not shout. The quiet command in his tone was enough to freeze her in place. She stared at him, stunned by the firmness she was not used to hearing from him, then turned her glare toward me, eyes bright with rage. My dad looked back at the papers, studied them in a silence that grew heavier by the second. He reached for the more recent test again, as if hoping his eyes had tricked him. He looked up at me with a question buried in his expression, one that trembled even before he asked it. I nodded once. His breath hitched. He whispered the only question that mattered. "When did you find out?" I told him the truth, that Grandma had given me the initial document when she was in the hospital, that I had taken a second test before coming, because I needed to be sure, that I had come to this meeting prepared to end the lies that defined my life. My mom cut in again, her voice rising with each accusation. She demanded that my dad ignore the results until they could be verified by someone they trusted. She said I had clearly planned this, that I was jealous of Bianca, that I wanted to tear the family apart. She said I had always been difficult, always been ungrateful, always been a problem to solve. My dad snapped at her to stop. The sound of his voice startled everyone in the room. It was not loud, but sharp, the crack of something breaking inside him. He stood abruptly and walked toward the far wall. He placed his hand against it, as though he needed support to stay upright. His shoulders rose and fell in uneven breaths. When he finally turned around, there were tears in his eyes. Not from anger, from grief. Deep, disorienting grief. He looked at me with a kind of shattered awe, as if he were seeing me for the first time. Not as an adopted child, not as someone outside the family, but as someone who had always belonged to him, without his knowing. Then he looked at my mom. His voice was soft but firm when he asked her how long she had known. She stepped back as if his question had pushed her. She said the timing was complicated. She said I should never have seen those documents. She said the family had functioned well enough as it was, and there was no need to dig up old wounds. She said DNA did not define a family. The irony of that statement sat in the air like smoke no one wanted to breathe. My dad shook his head slowly. He whispered that too many things suddenly made sense in ways he wished they did not. His voice cracked at the edges. Bianca let out a sob, clutching her hands to her face. She murmured that she did not know any of this. She sounded terrified, lost, not out of guilt, but because the life she had lived was slipping away from her. My mom turned on her sharply. Her voice snapped like a whip. She told Bianca to stop crying. She told her to sit up straight. She told her to control herself. Bianca flinched, and for the first time, I saw fear in her that had nothing to do with me. My dad pressed his hand to his forehead again and closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked at me instead of at my mom. It was the smallest shift, but it carried more weight than any words he could have spoken. He said quietly, "I need to know the truth." Those 6 words broke something open. It was the first time he had stepped out from under my mom's shadow, the first time he let himself question the story she had written for all of us. He walked back to the table, picked up the folder with both hands, and said he would take his own DNA test. Independent, verified. No influence from anyone. No room for doubt. He said he needed answers that could not be twisted or argued away. My mom sputtered, insisting it was unnecessary. She said it would humiliate the family. She said it would damage their reputation. My dad did not look at her. He said he would no longer protect lies. He said he needed to follow what felt right, not what he had been told to feel. Bianca cried harder, her body shaking in a way that looked almost fragile. I watched her quietly, feeling something shift inside me. It was not a pity, not anger, just the recognition that she too had been shaped by a world built on lies. She did not choose. My mom turned to me again, her words sharp and frantic. She accused me of ruining the family, of bringing chaos into a home that had functioned perfectly before my return. She said I was jealous of Bianca. She said I wanted to destroy everything. I looked at her calmly. I realized then that nothing I said would ever change the narrative she needed to believe. She had built her identity on being the one in control, the architect of a perfect image. The truth threatened the foundation she had stood on for more than 30 years. My dad set the papers down with shaking hands. He straightened, his voice quiet but resolute. He said the meeting was over. He would not discuss anything further until he had the final results. My mom stood there stunned, her authority cracked open. For the first time in my life, she seemed small. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. My dad turned to me and asked me to leave the folder with him. I nodded and handed it to him. He held it with a gentleness that felt unfamiliar, a reverence almost, as if the truth inside it was the key to everything he had never known. I stepped back, feeling the air shift around me. Something had ended in that room. Something had begun. I could sense it in the hollow quiet that followed. As I turned toward the door, I glanced back once. My dad stood staring at the papers, as if they were the sum of a life he had never fully understood. My mom was frozen, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Bianca sat shaking, her world cracking beneath her. The air felt fractured, honest, brutal. I walked out of the room knowing that this was the moment everything shifted. The air outside the house felt colder than when I had arrived. The kind of cold that comes not from weather, but from truth, settling over a place that has tried too long to hide from it. I sat in my car for several minutes before I could make myself drive away. My hands were steady on the wheel, even though my heart felt like it was learning an entirely new rhythm. Something had cracked open inside that house, something that could never be put back the way it was. 2 days passed before my dad called again. His voice sounded thinner than the last time, as if the truth had been dragging itself across him, leaving marks he had not expected. He said the results were ready. No preamble, no details, only that. I could tell he had barely slept. He asked if I could come back to Connecticut. Not a command this time. A request. I agreed and hung up. The drive felt long, every mile stretching out like the space between who I used to be and the woman I was becoming. When I reached the house, my dad opened the door before I could knock. His eyes were red, the whites clouded from exhaustion. He did not invite me inside right away. He simply held out a sealed envelope. It looked almost identical to the one Grandma had given me. I took it slowly and stepped past him into the living room. The house felt hollow, as if someone had peeled away the outer layer of calm and left only what was brittle underneath. I opened the envelope carefully. The words blurred for a moment before sharpening into clarity. The DNA test confirmed I was his biological daughter. It also confirmed Bianca was not. There were no loopholes, no margins of error, no questionable markers. The truth sat plain on the page, indifferent to the years of lies that had covered it. I did not realize I had stopped breathing until my dad lowered himself into the chair, his hands shaking in his lap. He whispered my name. It sounded like a confession, or maybe a prayer. I asked him how he felt, and he let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob. He rubbed his palms over his face and stared at the floor. Then he asked my mom to come into the room. When she appeared, her expression was as sharp as ever, but beneath the polish, I could see something jagged. She walked slowly, as if rehearsing the same old poise, but unable to fully pull it off. My dad held up the papers and asked her when the lies had started. He asked how long she had known. He asked why she had kept the truth from him. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it faltered. She said it did not matter anymore. She said DNA did not make a family. She said the timing had been complicated, that things had happened long ago that did not need to be rehashed. She said she had been trying to protect the family. Protect him. Protect Bianca. My dad looked at her like she was a stranger. He asked if everything he had believed about our family had been built on lies. He asked whether she had ever intended to tell him the truth, or if she had hoped it would disappear with time. She lifted her chin and said that telling him would have ruined everything, that he had been happy, that the life they had built worked, that he would not have wanted to know a truth that complicated. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said the one thing I think shattered whatever illusions she still held. He said that lies had already ruined everything. Not the truth. Lies. She went silent then. Truly silent. Not the cutting, careful silence she used when she was preparing an argument. This was something else. A crack through the center of her confidence. My dad stood and walked to the far window. His back was rigid. He said he was filing for divorce. He said their marriage had been built on conditions he had never agreed to. He said he could not continue living beside someone who had rewritten the most fundamental truth of his life. He said there was no path back from this. My mom gasped, a sharp sound, then immediately composed herself. She said he was overreacting. She said they could navigate this quietly. She said the world did not need to know that they could resolve everything behind closed doors. Image mattered. The community would talk. Their friends would ask questions. Their reputation would crumble. She sounded more afraid of exposure than of losing him. My dad told her the prenup would stand exactly as it was written, not a cent beyond what she had agreed to years ago. She stared at him, stunned, as if it had never occurred to her that he would enforce the boundaries she once starred, insisted on. Then she tried to turn on me. She said this was my doing, that I had orchestrated all of this because I wanted to destroy the family that had once taken me in. I told her calmly that I had not destroyed anything. I had only told the truth they were too afraid to speak. My dad did not correct me. He did not defend her. He simply watched her with a grief that made my chest ache, even though none of this pain belonged to me. The next few weeks unfolded like an unspooling thread. The divorce filings became public record. Their friends began to whisper. People who had once competed for my mom's attention now avoided her in grocery store aisles. Charity board members gently suggested she step back from public roles. Invitations stopped arriving. The people she once hosted in lavish dinner parties did not return her calls. I heard later that she tried to downplay the situation by saying the fall of the marriage had been a mutual decision. No one believed her. People sense when there is blood beneath polished wood. Bianca's unraveling came at the same time. Her business partners withdrew. She lost contracts. Her brand was mocked on social media after financial disclosures leaked through. Court filings. She tried to maintain her influencer persona, posing in curated outfits, writing captions about resilience. But the comments turned cruel. She had to sell her condo, then her car. She moved into a small apartment in a part of town she once viewed as beneath her. She had never lived without privilege. She had never lived without protection. She had never lived without the shield of being the Hale daughter. Now the people who once praised her avoided her calls as quickly as they had once answered them. I did not reach out, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because there was no relationship between us to repair. We had not spoken beyond necessity since that meeting. She needed to stand on her own feet for the first time in her life. Some lessons are only learned when all the scaffolding falls away. My mom's fall was slower, more painful. She tried to salvage her image through charity circles, but the gossip already had too strong a grip. People began questioning things she had long kept hidden. Old rumors resurfaced. The polished facade she had spent decades building cracked in places she could not repair. She blamed me, of course, whispered it to anyone who would listen, said I had stolen her family, said I had turned my dad against her. But truth leaves a shadow longer than any lie, and people did not rally behind her. My dad, meanwhile, seemed to move through the world like a man who had stepped into grief too heavy for language. He called me occasionally, never asking for anything, just wanting to hear my voice. His calls were strange, awkward, but gently persistent. I knew he was trying. I also knew he was carrying the guilt of years he had allowed silence to do his speaking. I kept boundaries, but did not shut him out. I understood what it cost him to reach for me. As for me, life did not change overnight, but something inside me settled. I had expected the fallout to feel like victory. It did not. It felt like balance, a quiet correction of a scale that had been tipped too far for too long. I did not interfere with their consequences. I did not gloat I did not use my position to hurt them further. Karma was moving through their lives without my help, slow dismantling everything built on deception. I stood apart from it, not untouched, but no longer burdened by the weight of their secrets. One afternoon, months after my dad's divorce filings, I visited Grandma. She was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the wind move across the field. I sat beside her, and she reached for my hand without a word. She asked how things were. I told her the truth, that everything was broken, but maybe broken things could let in a little light. She nodded, her eyes soft. Then she said something I have never forgotten. She said the truth never destroys families. It only destroys the lies that pretend to hold them together. As the sky dimmed and the first hint of night crept across the field, I realized that she was right. The truth had not ruined anything. It had only revealed what had been unraveling all along. I watched the sun sink behind the trees that evening in Vermont, the air turning cool around me as the last bit of light pulled itself across the field. For the first time in a long while, I felt the quiet settle inside me instead of against me. Something had ended in Connecticut. Something I had carried since childhood, and its absence left a strange kind of space. Not emptiness, more like room to breathe. In the weeks that followed the truth coming out, my dad began calling more often. At first it was awkward, uneven, his voice catching now and then, as if he needed to apologize but could not yet find the shape of the words. He told me about the divorce paperwork being processed. He told me about my mom packing her things. He told me he was sorry in small ways, not directly, but through the pauses between sentences. Each call felt like a man trying to rebuild a bridge he had once set fire to, without really understanding why. One afternoon he called and asked if I could meet him in Hartford for lunch. It surprised me, but I agreed. When I arrived, he was already seated, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He looked tired, but softer, as if the truth had lifted a weight he had carried without knowing it. We spoke about simple things at first. How Grandma was recovering, how work was going, how the weather was turning unseasonably warm. Then he cleared his throat, a gesture I had seen all my life when he was gathering courage. He said he wanted to talk about the company he owned. He said there was no one he trusted to take over when the time came. Bianca was no longer an option. The board did not support her. Associates had distanced themselves. He said he had spent many sleepless nights thinking about legacy and responsibility, and who deserved to inherit what he had built. He looked at me with a steadiness that almost made me look away. He said that the company should be mine, that he wanted to leave it to me, that I was the one who understood discipline and resilience and the quiet strength required to keep a business standing. For a moment, I could not speak. The offer felt heavy, not because of the size of it, but because of what it implied. A lifetime of being unseen. Then, suddenly being asked to hold everything. I told him I needed time. I told him I could not accept something that large simply because he felt guilty or because the truth had cornered him. I told him that if I ever took responsibility for his company, it needed to be out of choice, not as a consolation prize for the years he had not been a father. He nodded slowly, and something like respect crossed his expression. He said he understood. He said the offer would remain open for whenever I felt ready, even if that day never came. We finished lunch without speaking of it again. When we stood to leave, he hesitated before pulling me into a hug. It was stiff and unsure, like he was relearning how to hold a child he had once allowed to slip away. But I returned the gesture. Not fully, but enough to let him know I was willing to try. After that, I returned to Vermont. Not because I was running from anything, but because I needed to root myself again in something steady and familiar. Grant's farm had always been the first place where I felt wanted without conditions. When I arrived, Grandma was sitting at the kitchen table peeling apples, her hands moving with the slow confidence of a woman who had lived through too many storms to be shaken by one more. When she saw me, her smile spread warmly across her face. She said she knew I would be back soon. She said no truth was ever meant to be carried alone. We fell into a gentle routine. I worked remotely most days, answering emails from the kitchen table while the smell of something cooking drifted through the house. In the afternoons, I helped Grandma with small chores she was still too weak to manage. The simplicity of it soothed me. After everything that had happened, The quiet felt like medicine. Sometimes, while sweeping the porch or folding laundry beside her, I would think about the truth of my birth. I still had not opened the full contents of the envelope Grandma had given me. I kept it in a drawer in my room, not out of fear, but because I had learned that healing required pacing. Some truths could not be swallowed whole. They needed to be tasted slowly, piece by piece, when your heart was steady enough to hold them. My dad called once a week, sometimes more. The conversations grew easier with time. He asked about my work. He asked about Grandma. Occasionally, he would let something slip. A story about when I was little, something he had never told me. Small details that hinted at the father he might have been if lies had not stood between us. I listened with mixed emotions, but I listened. Meanwhile, not mean forgetting. It meant choosing which pieces to carry and which to set down. Bianca did not call. I heard things through the grapevine. She was working part-time at a boutique, trying to rebuild what her business had lost, trying to live without the cushion she had once assumed was permanent. I did not feel vindicated or triumphant. I felt something closer to sadness. She had been raised inside a world built on illusions. Losing that world was its own kind of grief. My mom vanished from public life. Occasionally, I would catch a whisper from someone who had seen her at a grocery store or a pharmacy, looking smaller than she had ever allowed herself to appear. People who once praised her no longer approached her. Her fall lasted longer than her rise. The weight of karma is quiet but certain. It does not need applause. It simply arrives when the truth has waited long enough. One evening, I sat with Grandma on the back porch. The sky was streaked with lavender and gold. She asked how I felt about everything that had happened. I told her the truth, that I was lighter, that I was stronger, that I did not hate my parents, but I no longer needed their approval to define my worth. She smiled, her eyes soft. She said that was the lesson life had been trying to teach me since the day I arrived at her doorstep. That love is not earned by usefulness. That belonging is not something you beg for. It is something given freely or not at all. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and earth. For a moment, I let my head rest on Grandma's shoulder. I felt small and held and safe, like I had when I was 12 years old and she had wrapped me in a blanket on my first night there. She whispered that I was home, and I realized she was right. Later that week, my dad drove up to Vermont to see us. It was the first time he had visited in years. He walked through the farmhouse slowly, touching the walls as if rediscovering memories he had buried too deeply. When he reached the kitchen, he paused and said softly that he should have never let me leave this place alone. Grandma placed a hand on his arm and told him that regret was a heavy coat, but he did not have to wear it forever. He nodded, his shoulders loosening just a little. The three of us sat at the table, sharing soup and bread. It felt strange, but good, as if a new version of our family was forming gently, not through obligation, but through choice. My dad did not push. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply showed up, week by week, conversation by conversation, learning the shape of being a father after so many years of silence. I could not pretend the wounds were healed. They were not, but they were no longer open. They were part of my story, not the end of it. In the morning, when I finally felt ready, I took out the envelope from my drawer. I held it for a long while before opening it. The papers inside filled in the missing pieces of my past. They confirmed details about my birth mother, the circumstances that had led me to the orphanage, and the truth about the fire that had changed the course of everything. I cried. Quietly. Not from grief alone, but from the strange relief of knowing at last who I was. When I finished reading, I walked outside and stood in the yard. The mountains spread out before me, steady and ancient. I felt grounded in a way I had never felt before. The truth had broken pieces open, but it had also stitched something inside me back together. I do not know what will happen with my dad's company. I do not know if I will ever take on the responsibility he offered. What I do know is that I will choose based on who I am now, not the girl who once tried to earn love by being useful. These days, when I wake up in Grandma's house and hear the soft sounds of the farm stirring, with morning, I feel a peace I did not know was possible. Not a victory, Not revenge, just the quiet dignity of a life built on truth. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.